I texted the family group chat that my flight landed at 7 and asked if someone could pick me up. My sister replied instantly, telling me it was not her problem and to take a cab because they were setting up for her husband Jamal and his partner track dinner. My mother chimed in immediately after adding that I should have planned better and warned me not to ruin my sister and her perfect night. I did not argue or beg. I simply typed back 2 words saying it is okay. What they did not know was that just hours later my name would flash across every major financial news network in the country, and suddenly those same people who could not spare 20 minutes from me would be blowing up my phone with desperate calls. My name is Claire, and I am 35 years old. If you have ever been the scapegoat of your family who was pushed out into the cold only to return as the one holding all the cards, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to hear how I turned my family's greatest betrayal into my absolute triumph. I stood at the baggage claim at John F. Kennedy International Airport, breathing in the stale, recycled air of the terminal. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the carousel, as my sleek black suitcase finally slid down the ramp. I was completely exhausted after a grueling red-eye flight from London, but my mind was sharper than ever. I pulled out my phone and opened the family group chat. It had been years since I asked them for absolutely anything. I typed out the simple request asking for a ride to Connecticut. I watched the 3 little typing dots appear under my sister Brittany and her name. Not our problem, Claire. Take an Uber. We are busy setting up the house for Jamal and his big partner track dinner tonight. I stared at the screen. Brittany was 32 years old, but she still wielded her entitlement like a weapon. She ran a supposed high-end lifestyle brand that was hemorrhaging money, but in our family, she was the undisputed golden child. Before I could even process the coldness of her message, another text popped up. This time, it was from our mother, Susan. You really should have planned better, Claire. You know how important tonight is for Jamal. Do not be selfish and ruin your sister and her special evening. A bitter laugh caught in the back of my throat. 10 years had passed since they effectively banished me from their lives, and absolutely nothing had changed. They still viewed me as the inconvenient burden, the financial liability, who could not get her life together. They still thought they held all the power. I did not cry. The girl who used to cry over their constant rejection died a long time ago in a tiny, freezing apartment in London. Instead, I adjusted my designer coat, unlocked my phone, and typed back a simple response. It is okay. Have a great dinner. I slipped the phone into my pocket, grabbed my suitcase, and walked out the sliding glass doors into the crisp evening air. The chaos of the airport pickup lane was deafening with horns blaring and people shouting, but I felt completely serene. A chauffeur in an immaculate black suit stepped out from beside a gleaming custom Maybach. He gave me a respectful nod and took my luggage, placing it carefully into the trunk before opening the plush leather door for me. I sank into the buttery leather seats of the luxury vehicle and let out a long breath. The partition went up, giving me total privacy as the car merged seamlessly into the heavy New York traffic. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the minibar and stared out at the passing city lights. My family thought I was returning home to beg for scraps. They thought I was still the naive 25-year-old girl they had thrown away a decade ago. 10 years ago, my parents forced me to pack my bags and move to Europe with barely a few $100s to my name. They sat me down at our massive mahogany dining table in their $4 million Connecticut estate and told me I was a disappointment. My father Richard looked me in the eye and said I lacked the drive to succeed in their world. What he really meant was that they needed a scapegoat to justify draining my college fund, and my grandmother and her inheritance to finance Brittany and her ridiculous vanity business. They handed all my money to the golden child and shipped me off, claiming I was too financially irresponsible to stay under their roof. They expected me to fail. They expected me to crawl back in a few months completely broken, but I did not fail. I spent the last 10 years working 80-hour weeks climbing the brutal corporate ladder to become a senior forensic accountant and eventually the managing partner at one of the most ruthless private equity firms in London. I spent a decade tearing apart complex financial webs, tracking hidden assets, and learning exactly how the wealthy hide their dirty secrets. I became a master at finding the missing numbers. And eventually, I started looking into the numbers of my own family. As the Maybach glided smoothly down the highway, the ambient lighting in the car cast a soft glow over my tablet. I tapped the screen and opened the master dossier I had been compiling for the last 6 months. My family still believed they were the elite, untouchable royalty of their suburban Connecticut bubble. They believed Jamal was a brilliant corporate lawyer bringing prestige to the family name. They believed Vanguard Holdings, the parent company that funded their lavish lifestyle, was just experiencing a minor temporary cash flow problem. They were completely wrong on every single count, and I was the only one who knew the absolute truth. The truth that they were drowning in a sea of hidden debt, illegal loans, and desperate fraud. The truth that their entire empire was built on a foundation of sand that was rapidly washing away. I smiled, taking a sip of the cold water. My mother told me I should have planned better. The irony was so rich, it was almost intoxicating. I had planned better than any of them could ever comprehend. Every move I made over the last decade was a calculated step toward this exact moment. I did not fly back to America to attend a family dinner or to ask for a place to stay. I came back to collect. I came back as the new majority shareholder of their entire existence. The ride back to Connecticut was silent, but the storm I was bringing with me was going to shatter their perfect world into a million irreversible pieces. I rested my head against the cool glass of the window, watching the skyline fade into the darker stretches of the interstate. The memory of their betrayal still pulsed under my skin, but it was no longer a wound. It was fuel. I thought about Brittany and how she would be commanding the dining room right now, barking orders at the catering staff she could not actually afford to pay. I thought about Jamal polishing his expensive watches, practicing his charming lawyer smile in the mirror, completely oblivious to the massive target resting squarely on his back. And I thought about my parents who had so easily discarded their eldest daughter to maintain a fragile illusion of superiority. They wanted to protect their social status more than they wanted to love their own child. They had created this monster. The girl they kicked out was desperate for their validation. The woman returning in the back of this Maybach did not need their love because she had just bought their entire livelihood. It is a strange feeling to know you hold the absolute destruction of your own blood relatives in the palm of your hand. I felt a brief, fleeting moment of hesitation, but it vanished the second I remembered the coldness of my mother's text message. Do not be selfish and ruin your sister and her special evening. I tapped the glass of my tablet, bringing up the final acquisition documents. My firm had finalized the hostile takeover of Vanguard Holdings just 2 hours before my plane touched down. It was a masterpiece of corporate maneuvering done entirely through anonymous shell companies and proxy buyers. No one in my family had any idea that the ruthless investor, who bought up all their defaulted loans and toxic debt, was the same woman they just told to take an Uber. The silence in the luxury car was absolute perfection. It was the calm right before the devastating hurricane. I closed my eyes and allowed myself a moment of pure, genuine peace. The decades of gaslighting, the emotional abuse, the constant comparisons to my perfect sister, it was all about to end. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was the landlord. I was the creditor. I was the ultimate consequence of their own greed. My phone sat silently on the leather seat next to me. The screen was dark. The group chat was quiet. They had dismissed me from their minds the second they sent those texts returning to their expensive wine and their hollow conversations. I took a deep breath, savoring the final moments of their ignorance. The countdown had already started, and they did not even hear the clock ticking. The storm was coming, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to hide. The silence inside the luxury car was shattered by a sharp, mechanical buzz. My phone sitting on the empty leather seat beside me lit up like a beacon in the dark cabin. I glanced down without moving my head. The caller ID flashed my mother's name, Susan. I did not pick up. I watched the screen go dark, but 3 seconds later it lit up again. This time it was my father, Richard. The screen went dark again, only to immediately flash back to life. Brittany. The phone began to vibrate uncontrollably, sliding an inch across the smooth upholstery. 10 missed calls, then 20. The device was practically having a seizure. Voicemails started piling into my inbox in rapid succession. Text messages flooded the lock screen, moving so fast I could barely read them. Where are you? Pick up the phone right now. What did you do? Answer me, Claire. By the time the Maybach crossed the bridge into Manhattan, I had exactly 41 missed calls from the 3 people who just an hour ago told me to take a cab because my presence was a burden. A soft chime echoed through the car's pristine audio system. The built-in tablet mounted on the privacy partition in front of me flared to life. The driver had the system tuned to a major financial news network. A bright red banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen reading "Breaking News." The anchor adjusted his papers and looked directly into the camera with absolute seriousness. He announced that Connecticut-based Vanguard Holdings, a cornerstone of regional real estate and private equity, had just been acquired in a stunning 11th-hour buyout, saving the massive firm from total bankruptcy. The anchor paused for dramatic effect before revealing that the anonymous buyer, who had orchestrated the ruthless hostile takeover over the past 6 months, had finally been unmasked to the board of directors. The new majority shareholder and absolute owner of the company was a 35-year-old financial prodigy and managing partner of a London-based equity firm. He looked at the camera and read my full name loud and clear into the quiet space of the car. Hearing my name broadcast on national television sent a cold wave of pure vindication down my spine. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, never taking my eyes off the tablet. Vanguard Holdings was not just some random corporate entity floating in the stock market. It was the absolute beating heart of my family's entire false reality. Vanguard was the massive parent company that held the crushing mortgage on my parents' $4 million colonial estate. Vanguard owned the commercial master lease for the entire high-rise building where Jamal ran his flashy corporate law firm. Vanguard controlled the hidden credit lines, the offshore accounts, and the complex investment portfolios that allowed Brittany to play the role of a highly successful entrepreneur while her lifestyle brand secretly bled cash every single day. My family thought they were independently wealthy. They walked around our affluent Connecticut suburb like royalty looking down on everyone else. They truly believed Jamal was a self-made legal titan and that my father was a genius investor. They did not understand that their wealth was just a fragile house of cards built entirely on toxic debt owed to Vanguard. And now Vanguard belonged to me. I owned the roof over their heads. I owned the floor beneath Jamal and his expensive custom-tailored suits. I held the strings to every single dollar they thought they had. The phone screen lit up once again, cutting through the dim lighting of the back seat. Call number 42. It was my mother. This time I slowly reached over, picked up the device, and pressed the green accept button. I brought the phone to my ear, but I did not say a single word. I just sat back and listened to the chaotic background noise on the other end of the line. I could hear the absolute panic echoing through their massive dining room. I could hear Brittany sobbing hysterically in the distance, screaming that her life was ruined. I could hear Jamal shouting at someone, demanding to know how a hostile takeover could happen without his legal team knowing about it. Then, my mother's voice pierced through the receiver, sharp, shrill, and completely unhinged. She did not say hello. She did not ask if I made it to the city safely. She did not apologize for abandoning me at the airport. She went straight into a blind, narcissistic rage. She screamed at the top of her lungs, asking what kind of sick, demented stunt I was trying to pull. She demanded to know how I manipulated the market to get my hands on those shares. She told me I was a deceitful, ungrateful child and ordered me to immediately transfer every single share of the company over to my father, where she claimed they rightfully belonged. She yelled that I was ruining Jamal and his partner track dinner. She shrieked that my father was having chest pains because of my selfish behavior, and that if anything happened to him, it would be my fault. She commanded me to order my driver to turn the car around, drive to Connecticut this instant, and sign the legal paperwork to fix my little mistake before she called the authorities. She sounded like a cornered animal lashing out with the only weapon she knew how to use, which was guilt. I let her scream. I listened to the raw desperation vibrating in her vocal cords. I let her exhaust her breath until she finally had to stop to gasp for air. When the line went quiet for a fraction of a second, I finally spoke. My voice was completely flat, ice cold, and devoid of any emotion. I told her that I do not take orders from my tenants. Then I pressed the red button and ended the call. I turned my phone on silent, tossed it back onto the leather seat, and watched the glowing lights of the Manhattan skyline rise up to greet me. The panic was no longer my problem to carry. I had a hotel suite waiting for me, and tomorrow I had a meeting with Jamal that he did not even know was coming. The Maybach pulled smoothly to a stop in front of the iconic Plaza Hotel. The doorman immediately stepped forward to open my door, greeting me by name. I stepped out onto the pavement, feeling the crisp night air against my face. The sheer opulence of the hotel, with its gleaming marble floors and crystal chandeliers, usually offered a sense of profound sanctuary. After the mental exhaustion of the flight and the chaotic phone calls, I was looking forward to nothing more than a hot shower and a glass of vintage wine in the absolute silence of my penthouse suite. I bypassed the main reception desk entirely. As a premium guest, I had a dedicated keycard that granted me direct access to the private residential elevators. I swiped my card and pressed the button for the top floor. The elevator ascended rapidly, leaving the noise of the bustling lobby far below. I closed my eyes and leaned back against the mirrored wall, running through the schedule for the next day. I had a morning meeting with my legal team to begin freezing Vanguard's most toxic assets. After that, I planned to formally audit Jamal and his law firm. I expected resistance, but I had all the time in the world. A soft bell chimed, signaling my arrival at the penthouse level. The polished brass doors slid open smoothly. I took a step forward and immediately stopped dead in my tracks. The private foyer, which was supposed to be completely restricted to penthouse guests, was not empty. Standing right in the middle of the plush custom carpet directly in front of my suite door were Brittany and Jamal. For a fraction of a second, I was genuinely surprised. The security at the plaza was notoriously strict. But then I noticed the night concierge standing nervously near his desk at the end of the hallway, his eyes darting between me and my uninvited family members. Jamal had his checkbook out earlier. He had thrown enough cash at the staff to bypass protocol, using his smooth-talking lawyer charisma to convince them it was a family emergency. Before I could even step entirely out of the elevator, Brittany launched her assault. She did not look like a woman whose husband was supposed to be celebrating a massive career milestone. She looked completely unhinged. She was dressed head to toe in an aggressively loud designer ensemble. She wore a pristine white Chanel trench coat over a silk dress, gripping a Birkin bag so tightly her knuckles were turning white. My analytical mind instantly calculated the retail value of her outfit. It was easily $70,000. Every single penny of it had been purchased using a corporate credit line from Vanguard Holdings, a credit line that I had personally frozen exactly 3 hours ago. "What the hell is wrong with you, Claire?" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing sharply against the marble walls of the corridor. She stomped toward me, her designer heels sinking into the carpet. The concierge visibly flinched at her volume. Brittany did not care who was watching. She thrived on public spectacle, using it as a weapon to force people into submission. "Did you honestly think you could just steal our father's company from right under our noses and hide in a hotel room?" she screamed, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "You are sick. You are a jealous, bitter psychopath. Daddy is having a panic attack right now because of your little stunt. You have ruined my entire life. My credit cards are declining. Jamal had to cancel his partner dinner because the restaurant said our accounts were locked. How dare you do this to us? She burst into tears. It was a spectacular performance. Her shoulders heaved, and she put a hand over her slightly rounded stomach, playing the ultimate victim. If I were still the scared 25-year-old girl they had thrown out of the house a decade ago, I would have crumbled under the weight of her public humiliation. I would have rushed to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, to do whatever it took to stop her from causing a scene. But I was not that girl anymore. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, holding my briefcase in one hand. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of panic. I simply looked at the concierge who was already reaching for his radio to call hotel security. I gave him a slight reassuring nod, silently communicating that I had the situation under complete control and that he did not need to intervene just yet. Brittany realized her tears were having absolutely no effect on me. She stopped crying almost instantly, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure rage. She opened her mouth to start screaming again, but Jamal stepped out from the shadows of the hallway and placed a heavy hand on her shoulder, pulling her back. Jamal was a tall, imposing man who knew exactly how to use his physical presence to intimidate people in a boardroom. He was wearing a custom-tailored Tom Ford suit that cost more than a small car. He adjusted his silk tie and looked down at me with an expression of supreme, arrogant confidence. He was the family fixer, the man my parents always called when they needed someone bullied into submission through legal threats. "Enough, Brittany." Jamal said, his voice a low, commanding baritone. "Let me handle this." He took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward me, invading my personal space. He was trying to force me to step backward into the elevator to establish physical dominance. I did not move a single inch. I held my ground, forcing him to stop closer to me than he intended. "Hello, Jamal," I said, my voice perfectly calm and even. "I see you missed your dinner." Jamal narrowed his eyes, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He dropped the charming facade he usually wore for judges and clients. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, dropping his voice into a cold, menacing register designed to strike absolute terror into whoever was listening. "Listen to me very carefully, Clare." Jamal said, every word dripping with condescension. "I do not know what kind of illegal wire fraud you committed to manipulate the board of Vanguard. I do not know what kind of shell games your little firm in London plays. But you have crossed a line that you cannot uncross. You are playing in the major leagues now, and you are way out of your depth." He gestured toward the heavy double doors of my penthouse suite. "You are going to open that door right now." He ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "We are going to go inside, sit down like rational adults, and you are going to sign the paperwork reversing this hostile takeover. If you do exactly what I tell you, I will personally convince Richard not to press federal charges against you for corporate espionage. I will fix your little mistake before it gets completely out of hand, and you end up spending the rest of your life in a federal prison. Do we understand each other?" He stared intensely into my eyes, waiting for me to break. He expected me to be intimidated by his legal jargon and his empty threats of federal prison. He expected me to be the naive younger sister who had no idea how the real world worked. I looked at him, studying the subtle signs of absolute panic hiding just beneath his aggressive posture. There was a slight tremor in his hands, a bead of sweat forming right at his hairline. Jamal knew exactly how bad the financial situation at Vanguard was. He knew that if a hostile buyer took over the books, his entire fake career would be exposed. He just did not want to believe that the buyer was me. I gave him a slow, chilling smile. It was the kind of smile that made my competitors in London walk away from the negotiation table. "Federal charges," I repeated softly, testing the words on my tongue. "That sounds terrifying, Jamal. You really must be worried about me to come all the way down here instead of eating your expensive steak." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavy brass keycard. I stepped around him, walking directly toward the doors of the penthouse. "By all means," I said, waving the card over the electronic lock. The light flashed green, and the heavy doors clicked open. Let us go inside and fix my little mistake. I would hate for things to get ugly. I pushed the doors open, revealing the sprawling, incredibly lavish living room of the suite overlooking Central Park. I stepped inside and turned around, leaving the door wide open for them. Brittany practically shoved her way inside first, eager to continue her tantrum in private. Jamal followed closely behind her, his chest puffed out, thinking he had just successfully bullied me into submission. He reached back and pulled the heavy doors shut behind him, sealing the three of us inside. He had absolutely no idea that he had just walked willingly into his own execution. The heavy thud of the solid oak doors closing behind us echoed through the massive living room, sealing out the rest of the world. The penthouse was entirely soundproofed, creating a suffocating quiet that Jamal and Brittany clearly thought worked in their favor. Brittany immediately marched over to the custom wet bar, dropping her $70,000 bag onto a velvet chair. She poured herself a glass of my imported sparkling water, complaining loudly about how her swollen ankles were killing her and how inconvenient my little stunt was for her pregnancy. She acted as if she were the rightful owner of the room, treating me like a minor nuisance she had to tolerate. Jamal ignored her and walked directly to the center of the room. He placed his expensive leather briefcase on top of the sprawling marble coffee table. The metallic click of the brass latches snapping open sounded incredibly loud in the silent room. It sounded like the cocking of a loaded weapon. He did not sit down. He stood tall, adjusting his suit jacket, trying to cast a long, intimidating shadow across the floor. "You have done very well for yourself, Clare." I will admit that Jamal said, his voice dripping with condescending false praise. "Managing partner at 35 is no small feat. It shows you have a sharp mind. But you let your childish emotions get the better of you. You let your petty jealousy over your sister cloud your judgment, and now you have stepped into an arena where you do not belong." He reached into the briefcase and pulled out a crisp manila envelope. He unwound the string closure with agonizing slowness, clearly enjoying the dramatic tension he thought he was building. "You see, Clare, your father is a very smart man," Jamal continued, pulling a thick, folded legal document from the envelope. "He knew that one day your unpredictable nature might become a liability. He knew that sending you away to Europe was a risk. So before you left, he made sure to secure an insurance policy, just in case you ever tried to do something completely reckless and self-destructive like attacking your own blood." He tossed the document onto the marble table. It slid across the smooth surface and stopped right in front of me. The bold black letters at the top of the page read, "General Power of Attorney." I looked down at the paper. It was a comprehensive legal mandate. According to the text, it granted my father Richard total and absolute control over my financial assets, my stock holdings, my banking accounts, and my corporate voting rights. At the bottom of the final page, sitting right above a certified notary stamp, was a signature that looked remarkably like mine. "I am going to march into federal court tomorrow at exactly 8 in the morning, Jamal said, leaning his knuckles on the table and staring me dead in the eye. "I am going to file this document with a judge. I will explain that you have a long documented history of severe mental instability and that your father is legally stepping in to protect your assets. The judge will immediately freeze your shares of Vanguard Holdings. Richard will assume total control as your legal proxy, and then we are going to reverse your little hostile takeover and put the company right back where it belongs." I stared at the document and then slowly looked up at Jamal. "You are threatening to steal my firm using a piece of paper I never signed." I did not raise my voice, but the sheer icy calm in my tone made Jamal falter for a fraction of a second. But before he could respond, Brittany scoffed loudly from across the room. She walked over, swirling the water in her crystal glass, a look of absolute disgust on her face. "Oh, please, Claire, stop playing the victim," Brittany sneered. "You were completely out of control 10 years ago. You were a mess. You should be thanking Daddy on your knees for stepping in. If he had not taken control of your finances, you would have just wasted all of that money anyway." She took a sip of her water, looking me up and down. "You know it is true. That is exactly why we had to take your college fund to help me launch my lifestyle brand. You were far too irresponsible to be trusted with a trust fund. It was an investment in the family, and you owed me that money anyway, for always being such a miserable burden growing up. There it was. The dark, ugly truth they had spent a decade trying to sweep under the rug laid bare in the middle of a luxury hotel room. They did not just exile me because I was the scapegoat. They exiled me because they robbed me blind and needed me gone before I could fight back. When my grandmother passed away, she left a trust fund of exactly $250,000, specifically designated for my college tuition and living expenses. It was my ticket to independence. But Richard and Susan had other plans. Brittany had just decided she did not want to work a real job and instead wanted to be the founder of a luxury wellness brand. But my parents were already swimming in hidden debt and could not afford the massive startup costs. So they simply took my future. They forged my consent, drained my entire trust fund, and used every single penny to lease a ridiculous high-end storefront in Manhattan for Brittany. A storefront that she effectively bankrupted in less than 3 years because she spent the operating budget on lavish vacations and designer clothes. When I found out the money was gone, I confronted them. Instead of apologizing, my parents gaslit me. They told me I was financially illiterate. They told me I was too emotionally unstable to handle that kind of wealth. They systematically stripped away my dignity, packed my bags, and forced me onto a plane to London with less than $500 in my checking account, telling our entire extended family that I was running away to find myself. They left me to starve in a freezing studio apartment on the outskirts of London. I spent the first 3 years sweeping floors at a local accounting firm during the day and working as a waitress at night just to pay for my forensic accounting classes. I survived on ramen noodles and tap water, while Brittany posted pictures of herself drinking champagne in Paris, using the money my grandmother had meant for my education. And now, 10 years later, they were trying to run the exact same play. They were trying to use the same narrative of my supposed instability to steal my empire, just like they stole my education. Jamal mistook my silence for fear. He stood up straight, buttoning his suit jacket with a smug, triumphant smile on his face. "This is how this ends," Clare, Jamal said, his voice taking on a soothing, patronizing tone. "You are not going to win this. If you fight me, I will drag your mental health history through the courts. I will call your partners in London and tell them their managing director is having a psychotic break. I will ruin your professional reputation so thoroughly you will never work in finance again. You will lose your firm. You will lose everything you built." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a gold fountain pen, placing it on top of the forged document. "Or you can be a good girl," Jamal said. "You can sit down right now, sign this transfer deed relinquishing your shares, and I will let you walk out of here. I will let you go back to your little life in Europe, and we can pretend this entire ugly situation never happened. The choice is yours." He crossed his arms over his chest, completely confident that he had just boxed me into a corner I could never escape. Brittany smirked, leaning against the wall, waiting for me to break down and cry, just like I used to when we were teenagers. I looked at the gold pen resting on the table. I looked at the forged signature on the fake document. I felt the familiar weight of their manipulation pressing down on my shoulders. But this time, it did not crush me. It energized me. I reached into my coat pocket and slowly pulled out my tablet, the screen already glowing in the dim light of the penthouse. I did not look scared. I looked completely amused. I swiped past my lock screen and opened a highly encrypted file directory. Jamal watched me, his confident posture faltering just a fraction as I tapped on a folder labeled Vanguard Legal. I turned the tablet around and set it down on the massive marble coffee table right next to his gold fountain pen. On the bright screen was a high-resolution digital scan of the exact same power of attorney document he had just thrown in my face. I looked at Jamal and kept my voice perfectly level. I told him that when you spend 10 years hunting down hidden assets and corporate fraud, you develop a very specific habit. You learn never to trust a single piece of paper without verifying the metadata. I reached forward and used 2 fingers to zoom in on the bottom right corner of the document on my screen, magnifying the blue ink of the notary stamp. I read the date on the stamp aloud, letting the numbers hang in the quiet room. The official seal indicated that I had personally appeared before a state notary in Connecticut on October 14th, 10 years ago, to sign away my rights. Then I slowly swiped to the next image in the file. It was a scanned copy of my old passport complete with the official customs entry stamp from Heathrow Airport in London. The date of entry, clearly marked in bold red ink, was October 11th. I looked up at Jamal and offered him a freezing smile. I pointed out that it was physically impossible for me to sign a legally binding document in the state of Connecticut 3 days after I had already cleared international customs 5,000 miles away. The document sitting on my coffee table was not an insurance policy. It was a sloppy, poorly executed forgery. The color drained from Jamal's face so fast he looked physically ill. His eyes darted frantically between the digital scan on my tablet and the physical paper resting on the marble table. The brilliant corporate lawyer had just walked straight into a trap of his own making. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and reminded him of the law. I told him that knowingly presenting a forged legal document with the intent to extort financial assets was a severe felony. I asked him how the State Bar Association would react when I handed over the security footage of him threatening me with it inside my own hotel room. Jamal swallowed hard, the prominent lump in his throat bobbing nervously. The smug, arrogant bully who had threatened me with federal prison just moments ago was completely gone. Panic set in. He lunged forward, reaching out to grab the paper off the table to destroy the evidence. But I was faster. I snatched the document away before his fingers could even brush the paper, folding it neatly and slipping it into the inside pocket of my jacket. I stepped back and told him he was not taking his evidence anywhere. Brittany watched the entire exchange, her mouth hanging open in absolute shock. She realized instantly that Jamal had lost. Her husband, the untouchable family fixer, had just been cornered, and he was now facing serious prison time and disbarment. But Brittany had spent her entire life manipulating situations to avoid facing any real consequences. She knew she could not win a legal battle against me, so she immediately resorted to the only weapon she had left. She spun around and sprinted toward the heavy oak doors of the penthouse. She grabbed the brass handles, yanking them open and spilling out into the private foyer. Before I could even take a step toward her, Brittany threw herself violently against the polished brass doors of the elevator. She slid down to the floor, clutching her pregnant stomach, and began to scream. It was not a normal scream. It was a blood-curdling theatrical shriek designed to echo down the entire hallway and alert everyone on the floor. She started hyperventilating, taking massive, gasping breaths and tearing at the collar of her expensive Chanel coat as if she were suffocating. She wailed that I was attacking her. She sobbed at the top of her lungs, crying out that I was a monster, trying to steal her family and throw the innocent father of her unborn baby into a cold jail cell. "Help us!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble walls. "Somebody please help us! She is trying to hurt my baby!" Jamal recognized the play instantly. He rushed out into the hallway, dropping to his knees beside her, playing the role of the protective, terrified husband. He wrapped his arms around her, shouting down the hallway for someone to call for medical assistance. The sheer volume of her screams worked exactly as she intended. The private elevator chimed loudly and the doors slid open right behind her. The night concierge burst out of the elevator, followed closely by 2 burly hotel security guards in dark suits. They stepped into the foyer and immediately saw the chaotic scene. Brittany was on the floor weeping hysterically, clutching her stomach while Jamal held her tight, glaring up at me like I was a violent criminal who had just assaulted his wife. I was standing calmly in the doorway of my penthouse, holding my tablet and looking completely unfazed. To the security team, I did not look like the victim of an extortion plot. I looked exactly like the cold, calculating aggressor Brittany was painting me to be. One of the security guards immediately stepped forward, placing his body firmly between me and my sister. He rested his hand on his radio, and ordered me in a harsh, authoritative voice to step back into the room and keep my hands where he could see them. Brittany buried her face in Jamal's shoulder, hiding a malicious smirk that only I could see. The trap had been successfully turned back on me. She had changed the narrative from corporate fraud to physical assault in a matter of seconds. And as the security guard pulled out his radio to call the local police, I realized this war was going to require a much bigger stage. The hotel security guard kept his hand resting defensively on his radio, glaring at me as if I were a volatile threat. I did not raise my voice or argue with him. I simply reached into my briefcase, pulled out my platinum hotel identification card, and handed it to the concierge who was standing nervously in the hallway. I calmly explained that I was the registered guest of the penthouse suite and that the two people causing a massive disturbance on the floor were uninvited trespassers attempting to extort me with forged legal documents. Jamal was a lawyer, and he knew exactly how this was going to play out. He knew that if the local police arrived, they would eventually demand to see the paper he had just tried to use to threaten me. He immediately panicked. He dropped his protective husband routine, grabbed Brittany by the arm, hauled her to her feet, and practically dragged her into the private elevator before the authorities could officially intervene. The door slid shut on her theatrical sobbing, leaving me standing in the quiet luxury of my suite. The opening battle was over, but I knew the war was going to require a much bigger stage. 2 days passed in absolute silence. It was Thursday morning, Thanksgiving. Traditionally, this was a day my family used to flaunt their wealth to the neighbors, hosting lavish catered dinners while secretly despising each other behind closed doors. I was sitting in my temporary corporate office in Manhattan, reviewing the final liquidation schedules for Vanguard Holdings, when a notification popped up on my laptop screen. It was an email from my father, Richard. It was not a warm holiday greeting. It was a formal, coldly worded summons. He demanded that I attend Thanksgiving dinner at their $4 million estate in Connecticut at exactly 5 o'clock that evening. The subject line of the email read, "Family Truce." He wrote that it was time to put our petty differences aside, act like adults, and negotiate a sensible exit strategy for everyone involved. My background in hostile corporate takeovers told me exactly what this email really was. It was not a truce. It was an ambush. Richard was a man who only negotiated when he had a hidden knife securely tucked up his sleeve. He realized that intimidation had failed at the hotel, so he was pivoting to his home turf where he controlled the environment. He wanted to surround me with the psychological weight of the family home to force me into submission. I accepted the invitation. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously preparing for the evening. I did not dress like the grateful estranged daughter returning home to beg for scraps and forgiveness. I dressed like the managing partner of a multi-billion-dollar equity firm, preparing to completely gut a failing corporation. I wore a tailored midnight blue suit that projected absolute authority and paired it with a vintage designer watch that cost more than Jamal's entire law degree. But my wardrobe was only the surface level of my preparation. I opened a secure metal lockbox I had brought with me from London and pulled out a tiny high-definition audio transmitter. I clipped the hidden microphone discreetly inside the lapel of my jacket, syncing it directly to my private security team, who were waiting on standby back in the city. I was walking voluntarily into a house filled with vipers, and I was going to make absolutely sure every single word of their toxic venom was recorded and backed up to a secure cloud server. Finally, I slipped my secret weapon, a single folded piece of heavy stamped legal paper, into the inner pocket of my designer handbag. The drive to Connecticut was a journey through my own miserable past. The Maybach navigated the winding tree-lined roads of Fairfield County, pulling into the massive circular driveway of my parents' sprawling brick colonial estate just as the sun began to set. The manicured lawns were lightly dusted with the first pristine snow of the season. From the outside, it looked like a picture-perfect postcard of American wealth and stability. But I knew the deep financial rot hiding behind the expensive mahogany front doors. I stepped out of the luxury car feeling the cold winter air bite at my cheeks. I leaned down and told my driver to keep the engine running because I did not plan on staying for dessert. I walked up the wide stone steps, but I did not bother knocking. I reached out, pushed the heavy brass handle, and opened the front door myself. The familiar scent of roasted turkey, expensive pine candles, and polished wood hit me instantly, transporting me back to my miserable teenage years. The house was dead quiet. There was no festive music playing and no warm greetings echoing from the kitchen. I walked slowly through the grand foyer, my heels clicking sharply against the imported Italian marble floor. I stepped through the wide archway and entered the formal dining room. The massive crystal chandelier cast a bright, warm glow over the long mahogany table. The Thanksgiving feast was already perfectly arranged with heavy silver platters, steaming bowls of food, and expensive crystal wine glasses catching the light. My mother Susan and my father Richard sat stiffly at opposite ends of the table, presiding over the room like royalty. Jamal and Brittany sat close together on one side, projecting a united front. Brittany shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom. Her miraculous recovery from her supposed hotel panic attack was incredibly fast. She looked perfectly fine sitting there in another expensive designer dress, sipping sparkling cider. I walked slowly toward the table, taking in the exact layout of the room. Richard did not stand up to greet me. Susan did not offer me a smile. Jamal just watched me with narrow, calculating eyes, waiting to see my next move. I stopped at the edge of the carpet and looked down at the beautiful holiday spread. There were exactly 4 incredibly elaborate place settings arranged on the pristine white tablecloth, complete with silver cutlery, linen napkins, and gold-rimmed plates. There was no plate set for me. It was a classic psychological power play orchestrated by Susan. It was her way of silently communicating that I was not a guest, and I was certainly not family. I was an intruder who was only allowed in the room to do exactly what I was told. 10 years ago, standing in this exact room looking at an empty space at the table would have completely broken my heart. I would have felt the crushing weight of their rejection and internalized it as my own personal failure. But today I just looked at the missing plate and felt a wave of absolute power wash over me. I reached out, grabbed a heavy wooden dining chair from the corner of the room and dragged it loudly across the hardwood floor. The harsh scraping sound echoed aggressively through the silent room, making Brittany physically flinch. I planted the chair directly across from my sister, right in the middle of the table, and sat down, crossing my legs with total confidence. I folded my hands on the pristine white tablecloth, looked directly at my father, and told him to go ahead and start the negotiation. Richard stared at me for a long, heavy moment, his jaw muscles working furiously under his skin. He did not like that I had broken his carefully orchestrated staging. He had designed this entire evening to make me feel small and isolated, standing awkwardly at the edge of the room while they enjoyed their lavish feast. By dragging my own chair to the center of the table and demanding we skip the pleasantries, I had instantly stripped away his illusion of control. He looked down at his perfectly carved slice of turkey, and then slowly placed his silver fork onto his china plate. He reached down to the floor beside his chair and picked up a thick brown leather portfolio. He opened it and pulled out a crisp stack of legal papers bound by a blue paperclip. Without saying a word, he slid the documents across the polished mahogany table. The papers glided smoothly over the wood, stopping right next to a crystal gravy boat directly in front of me. I looked down at the bold heading printed on the first page. It was a formal severance and non-disclosure agreement. "I want to make this as painless as possible for everyone involved," Richard said, his voice adopting the calm, measured tone of a reasonable businessman negotiating a minor inconvenience. "We are willing to overlook the incredibly deceitful way you acquired those shares. We are willing to pretend this entire embarrassing ordeal never happened. If you sign that document right now, you will legally transfer all of your voting rights and ownership stakes in Vanguard Holdings back into my name. In exchange, we are prepared to offer you a one-time cash buyout of $100,000. I sat perfectly still looking at the paper and then looking back up at my father. $100,000. It was an absolutely insulting number. Vanguard Holdings, even with its massive hidden debt profile, controlled hundreds of millions of dollars in regional commercial real estate. But Richard still thought I was the desperate broke girl they had thrown out 10 years ago. He thought tossing a fraction of my stolen college fund back at me would be enough to make me quietly disappear. I did not touch the pen. I did not even reach for the document. I just stared at him, my expression completely blank. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and perfectly even. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and steepled his fingers together. The mask of the reasonable businessman completely vanished, replaced by the cold, ruthless patriarch who had bullied his way through life. "If you refuse, we will destroy you," Clare, Richards stated plainly. "I already have a crisis management public relations firm on retainer. If you do not sign that paper by the time we finish dessert, I will personally make a phone call to a contact I have at the Wall Street Journal. We will give them a highly detailed anonymous tip claiming that you embezzled millions of dollars from your European clients to secretly fund your hostile takeover of my company." Jamal sat back in his chair, swirling the red wine in his glass, a smug look of satisfaction on his face. He jumped into the conversation, eager to flex his legal muscles. "Defamation is incredibly hard to prove in court," Claire, Jamal added smoothly, "especially when the story hits the international financial press. The moment that article goes live, your partners in London will panic. They will suspend you immediately pending a full internal investigation. The regulatory boards will freeze your forensic accounting license. You will become completely radioactive in the corporate world. Even if you somehow manage to clear your name years from now, your reputation will be in ashes. You will lose your firm, you will lose your career, and you will end up with absolutely nothing." They had really thought this through. It was a classic extortion play. They were threatening to ruin my entire life based on a fabricated lie unless I handed over a multi-million-dollar company. It was textbook blackmail, and it was a severe federal crime. I felt a small thrill of pure adrenaline rush through my veins. I subtly adjusted my posture, leaning slightly forward to ensure the hidden microphone clipped inside my jacket lapel caught every single syllable of their criminal conspiracy. I needed them to keep talking. I needed them to dig the hole so deep they could never climb out. "So you are going to intentionally lie to the international press to destroy my career simply because you want my company?" I asked, making sure the phrasing was as clear and legally unambiguous as possible. "It is not a lie if everyone believes it." Richard shot back, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "The narrative is whatever I say it is. You have always been the unstable one in this family. People will easily believe that you snapped and stole the money just to get back at us." Before I could prompt him further, my mother decided it was her turn to twist the knife. Susan took a delicate sip of her wine and placed the glass down with a sharp clink. She looked at me with a mixture of absolute disgust and twisted pity. "You have always been such a bitter, jealous girl, Claire," Susan said, her voice dripping with toxic condescension. "You have spent your entire life trying to destroy your sister because you could never stand the fact that she was happy and you were miserable." She gestured toward Brittany, who was sitting quietly playing the role of the fragile pregnant victim perfectly. "Just look at what you did at her wedding," Susan continued, her voice rising in theatrical indignation. "Brittany planned the most beautiful day of her life, and you showed up in that cheap, inappropriate navy dress, looking like an absolute disaster, just to embarrass us in front of Jamal's influential family. You sat in the back row with a miserable scowl on your face, refusing to smile for the photographs, refusing to celebrate her joy. You could not even let her have one perfect day without trying to make it all about your own pathetic misery." I listened to her rewrite history right in front of me. The wedding she was referring to happened 5 years ago. I had flown all the way from London on a budget airline, spending money I barely had just to support my sister. The navy dress was not cheap. It was the nicest thing I owned at the time. I sat in the back row because Susan explicitly told the wedding planner to seat me as far away from the cameras as possible so I would not ruin the aesthetic of the bridal party. And I did not scowl. I sat quietly fighting back tears of complete humiliation while my own family treated me like an unwanted stranger at a public event. But I did not defend myself. I did not correct her. Arguing with a narcissist about the past is a completely useless endeavor. It only gives them the emotional reaction they are desperately trying to provoke. Instead, I let the silence stretch out over the dining table. I looked at Susan. I looked at Brittany. I looked at Jamal, and finally, I looked back at Richard. They were all watching me, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They expected me to start crying. They expected me to yell and scream and beg them to understand my side of the story. They expected me to reach for the pen with trembling fingers and sign my life away just to stop the relentless psychological abuse. I slowly reached my hand out toward the center of the table. Richard smirked, thinking he had won. Brittany let out a soft, condescending sigh of relief. Jamal took another confident sip of his wine. My fingers brushed against the thick blue paperclip holding the severance agreement together. But I did not pick up the pen. Instead, I placed my index finger firmly on the center of the document and slowly slid it back across the mahogany table. It glided over the polished wood and came to a dead stop right next to Richard's plate. I looked directly into my father's eyes, and I let a cold, chilling smile spread across my face. "I think there is a massive misunderstanding happening here tonight," I said, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. I did not spend the last 10 years mastering forensic accounting and international corporate law, so I could come back here and beg for your approval. I did not buy Vanguard Holdings because I wanted an invitation to eat dry turkey at your dining table. I leaned back in my chair, resting my hands comfortably on my lap. I felt the comforting weight of the hidden microphone against my chest and the folded deed in my handbag. The extortion attempt was fully recorded. The psychological warfare had completely failed. It was finally time to stop letting them control the narrative, and time for me to drop the bomb that was going to shatter their entire fake reality. "I bought Vanguard Holdings to liquidate it," I said softly, watching the smug confidence slowly begin to drain from Richard's face. "And more importantly, I bought it because I finally got to look at the internal audit ledgers. And I know exactly what you and Jamal have been doing with your client's money." The silence in the dining room was so absolute, you could hear the heavy pendulum of the antique grandfather clock swinging in the hallway. Brittany stopped swirling the sparkling cider in her crystal glass. Susan froze with her wine halfway to her mouth, her perfectly manicured fingers gripping the stem tightly. But Richard and Jamal did not flinch. They simply stared at me, waiting to see if I actually held any real cards or if I was just bluffing. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the pristine white tablecloth. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, surgical precision of a professional who had just spent 6 months dissecting their entire lives. I told them that the forensic audit took me exactly 48 hours to complete once my firm gained administrative access to the Vanguard servers. I laid out the exact methodology of their massive criminal enterprise right there over the Thanksgiving turkey. I explained how Richard had been taking millions of dollars in capital investments meant for regional commercial real estate developments and quietly siphoning those funds into a complex labyrinth of offshore shell companies. Then I turned my attention directly to Jamal. I watched his smug expression falter for a fraction of a second as I detailed exactly how he used his highly respected corporate law firm to wash the stolen money. I explained that he was funneling the stolen investor capital through his legal escrow accounts, claiming attorney-client privilege to hide the massive transactions from state and federal regulators. Once the money was completely untraceable through his firm, he wired it directly into the primary operating accounts of Brittany's failing luxury wellness brand. I looked across the table at my sister. She was blinking rapidly, trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of what I was saying. I told her that her entire life was a heavily funded illusion. Her expensive Manhattan storefront, her lavish business trips to Paris, her massive marketing campaigns were all paid for by innocent investors who thought their money was building shopping centers. I told her that Vanguard Holdings was not failing because the commercial real estate market was tough. It was failing because Richard and Jamal had completely hollowed it out from the inside, draining over $20 million over 4 years just to subsidize her ridiculous vanity project. I expected at least a flicker of genuine fear. I expected Jamal to pale like he did back at the Plaza Hotel when I confronted him with the forged document. But instead, Richard let out a loud, booming laugh. The sound echoed harshly off the crystal chandelier above us. He picked up his linen napkin, wiped his mouth casually, and tossed it onto his plate next to his untouched food. He looked at me with a mixture of dark amusement and absolute pity. He told me I was a foolish little girl playing a high-stakes game I simply did not understand. He did not even bother to deny the wire transfers. He was far too arrogant to believe he could ever face real consequences for his actions. He claimed he built Vanguard Holdings with his own bare hands, and therefore he had the absolute right to move capital wherever he saw fit. He called it creative wealth management. He told me that taking money from wealthy investors to support his own family was not a crime, it was a privilege of his social class. Jamal smiled widely, leaning back in his heavy wooden chair and crossing his arms over his chest. He used his smooth, condescending courtroom voice to explain that my so-called audit trails were completely useless in the real world. He told me that every single wire transfer was legally documented as a high-risk venture capital loan. He bragged that he had personally drafted the impenetrable paperwork protecting Richard from any personal liability. Jamal looked me dead in the eye and told me that even if I took my little audit to the authorities, it would take federal financial investigators a decade to untangle the corporate structures he had built. By the time they figured it out, the money would be gone and my family would be untouchable. Susan let out a dramatic sigh of relief, reaching over to pat Richard's hand. She looked at me with a triumphant smirk, completely ignoring the fact that her husband and son-in-law had just openly admitted to running a massive embezzlement scheme. Richard reached for his wine glass, completely unbothered by my accusations. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive vintage and looked around his magnificent dining room. He told me he always knew I was a deeply resentful child. He admitted that when my London equity firm first started buying up Vanguard's toxic debt a few months ago, he had a small suspicion I might be the anonymous buyer pulling the strings. He knew I was bitter enough to try and orchestrate a hostile takeover to get back at them for kicking me out of the house 10 years ago. So he took precautions. Richard smiled a wide, predatory grin that made my stomach turn. He told me that buying Vanguard Holdings was the most financially disastrous mistake I could have ever made in my entire career. He explained that I had just purchased a massive empty shell loaded with hundreds of millions of dollars in unpayable debt. And while I was busy celebrating my grand hostile takeover, he was busy protecting his actual wealth. Richard leaned across the table, his eyes gleaming with absolute malicious triumph. He revealed that yesterday morning, the moment the acquisition was finalized, he legally transferred the deed of this $4 million Connecticut estate into an impenetrable offshore blind trust. He proudly announced that he had moved all of his liquid cash, his personal investment portfolios, and Susan's luxury assets into the exact same trust account. Jamal chimed in, laughing softly to himself. He explained the legal mechanics of the trap they had set for me. He said that the blind trust was completely insulated from Vanguard's corporate liabilities. They had legally separated their personal wealth from the sinking ship of the company before the ink on my purchase agreement was even dry. Jamal told me that I was now the sole owner of a completely bankrupt corporation. The moment the public found out the money was gone, I would be the one left holding the bag. I would be personally responsible for paying back all the furious investors and facing the wrath of the regulatory boards. Brittany finally found her voice. She let out a sharp, cruel laugh, leaning her head onto Jamal's shoulder. She mocked me, saying I had spent 10 years trying to ruin them only to end up ruining myself. She told me I was going to lose my fancy job in London and end up right back where I started with absolutely nothing to my name. Richard looked at me with absolute contempt, the kind of pure hatred usually reserved for a sworn enemy, not a daughter. He told me I could have his hollow company. He told me I could take the massive corporate debt and choke on it, but I could never touch their money, and I could absolutely never touch their beautiful home. The blind trust was sealed, and they were completely safe from the fallout. He pointed a stiff finger toward the front door of the estate. He ordered me to get out of his dining room and out of his house immediately before he called the local police and had me arrested for trespassing. He told me my little revenge plot was over and that I had completely destroyed my own life trying to cross him. They sat there looking at me like I was a defeated animal caught in their brilliant trap. They were so incredibly confident in their own superior intelligence. They really thought they had outsmarted a senior forensic accountant who specialized in dismantling offshore shell companies. I let their laughter and insults fill the room, making sure my hidden microphone captured every single confession of their premeditated fraud. I looked at Richard. I looked at Jamal. And I reached into my designer handbag to pull out the one piece of paper they never saw coming. I kept my eyes locked directly on my father as my hand slipped into the soft interior of my designer bag. The room was heavy with their shared arrogance. They were practically vibrating with the thrilling satisfaction of putting me in my place. I could see the triumphant gleam in Richard's eyes and the condescending smirk plastered across Jamal's face. They had played their grand masterstroke, and they were simply waiting for me to stand up, admit defeat, and walk out into the freezing Connecticut night. Instead, I pulled my hand out of the bag holding a single thick document folded neatly in thirds. The paper was heavy premium cardstock bound at the top with a dark blue legal seal. I did not throw it. I did not slam it down in anger. I held it gently between my fingers and placed it right in the middle of the pristine white tablecloth, directly next to the ridiculous severance agreement they had tried to force me to sign. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the solid mahogany table seemed to echo in the quiet room. Jamal let out a short, dismissive scoff. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defensively. "What is this, Clare?" he asked, his tone dripping with absolute boredom. "Did you print out a fake injunction? Are you trying to serve us with a meaningless civil lawsuit? I already told you that you cannot pierce the veil of a blind trust. Whatever piece of paper you just pulled out of your purse is completely worthless in this house." I did not look at Jamal. I kept my gaze fixed entirely on Richard, watching the subtle shifts in his expression. I reached forward and slowly unfolded the document, smoothing the creases flat against the table. The bright overhead light from the crystal chandelier illuminated the intricate red stamp of the county clerk and the bold black lettering across the top of the page. "It is not a lawsuit," I said, my voice dropping into a quiet, deadly calm. "And it is certainly not worthless." Richard squinted, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read the upside-down text from across the table. Susan let out an annoyed sigh, adjusting her posture as if my mere presence was exhausting her. She reached for her wine glass, muttering something under her breath about how I always had to be so dramatic and exhausting. I rested my fingertips on the edge of the document. "You see, Richard, you are a very arrogant man." I began speaking slowly to ensure every single word registered in his mind. "You have spent your entire life believing that you are the smartest person in any room. You believed that you could hide stolen investor capital in offshore accounts, and nobody would ever be clever enough to track it. You believed Jamal and his law degree made you completely bulletproof." I paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the tension to wrap around their throats. "When you set up that blind trust yesterday morning, you thought you were pulling off the ultimate escape," I continued. "You drafted the paperwork, you signed the transfer deeds, and you initiated the wire transfers to move all your liquid assets and the ownership of this $4 million estate into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. You thought you were safely removing your personal wealth from the sinking ship of Vanguard Holdings." Richard lifted his chin, a defiant sneer forming on his lips. "I did not just think I did it," He snapped, his voice harsh and grating. "The trust is completely sealed. You are wasting your breath, Claire. Get out of my house." I smiled a genuine cold smile that finally made the sneer falter on my father's face. "But you forgot one incredibly important detail about how corporate banking actually works," I said, leaning in closer. "You forgot that 3 years ago, when Vanguard Holdings was desperate for a massive influx of cash, you quietly used that exact same offshore account as collateral to secure a high-risk commercial loan, a loan that has been completely delinquent for over 14 months. Jamal suddenly stopped breathing. The color began to drain from his face as his lawyer brain instantly calculated the massive catastrophic error I had just pointed out. He uncrossed his arms and leaned forward, staring at the document on the table with wide, terrified eyes. "When my firm bought Vanguard Holdings, we did not just buy the parent company." I explained, the trap snapping shut with flawless precision. "We bought all of the subsidiary debt, all of the contracts, and all of the collateral rights. Yesterday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, I personally authorized Vanguard to execute an immediate margin call on all delinquent collateral accounts." I looked at Richard, watching the arrogant defiance slowly melt into utter confusion. "I seized your offshore account, Richard," I stated plainly. "I froze the assets and initiated a corporate clawback to cover the stolen funds. Which means that yesterday afternoon, when you proudly tried to wire your cash and transfer the deed of this house into that exact same trust, the account was already locked down by my legal team." The room went completely still. Even the air felt too heavy to breathe. "Your transfer bounced," I said, the words echoing like a gavel striking wood. "The blind trust was never actually funded. It is an empty, worthless shell." "No," Richard whispered, his voice cracking. The single word was barely audible. "That is impossible." Jamal set up the firewall. Jamal made sure it was separate. Jamal did not answer him. Jamal was staring at the paper on the table, looking physically sick. He reached out with a trembling hand and spun the document around so he could read the text right side up. I kept my voice perfectly steady, delivering the final devastating blow. "Because you attempted to change the legal ownership of this estate while the property was tied to a defaulting corporate entity, you automatically triggered a breach of contract clause with the primary mortgage lender. You essentially told the bank you were trying to hide the asset. So the bank responded exactly how banks always respond to fraud. They initiated an immediate emergency foreclosure." Brittany finally broke the silence. Her voice was shrill and laced with rising panic. "What is she talking about, Jamal?" she demanded, grabbing his arm and shaking it. "Tell her to shut up. What does she mean the transfer bounced?" Jamal ignored her. His eyes were scanning the heavy cardstock, reading the legal clauses, the notarized signatures, and the bright red stamp from the county clerk. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. "The bank took the house yesterday evening," I continued, my voice cutting through Brittany's rising hysteria. "And because Vanguard Holdings holds the secondary liens on the property, the bank offered me the first right of refusal for a private cash sale." I walked into the regional banking office at exactly 10 o'clock this morning, and I paid the entire outstanding balance on this estate in pure, unadulterated cash. Jamal dropped the document as if it had burned his fingers. He looked up at Richard, his face a mask of absolute horror. "She is not bluffing, Richard," Jamal said, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "It is a finalized warranty deed. The county clerk stamped it this morning. She paid the mortgage off completely." Susan let out a sharp, terrified gasp, dropping her crystal wine glass. It hit the mahogany table and shattered, sending dark red wine spilling across the pristine white tablecloth like blood. She pressed her hands over her mouth, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Richard sat completely frozen in his heavy wooden chair. The man who had terrorized me for my entire childhood, the man who had stolen my college fund and banished me to another continent, looked like he had just been struck by lightning. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair so tightly his knuckles were completely white. I looked down at the shattered glass and the spilled wine seeping into the expensive fabric. Then I looked slowly around the grand dining room, taking in the crystal chandelier, the polished floors, and the massive oil paintings hanging on the walls. This was the room where they had always made me feel completely worthless. This was the room where they had stripped away my dignity and laughed at my pain. I turned my attention back to the three people sitting at the table. They looked pathetic. The illusion of their massive wealth, their social superiority, and their untouchable status had just evaporated into thin air. They were completely bankrupt, exposed, and trapped. I folded my hands neatly on the table right next to the official deed. "You do not own this dining table," I said, my voice echoing loudly in the suffocating silence. "You do not own that crystal chandelier. You do not own the massive turkey sitting in front of you. And as of 10 o'clock this morning, every single one of you is officially trespassing on my private property." I did not raise my voice, but the absolute finality in my tone hung heavy in the air. I slowly pulled back the sleeve of my midnight blue blazer and glanced down at my vintage watch. The second hand ticked silently across the pristine dial. I looked back up at the three stunned faces staring at me. I told them they had exactly 5 minutes. I instructed them to go upstairs, pack whatever personal clothing they could fit into a single suitcase, and walk out the front door. I made it very clear that any designer furniture, valuable artwork, or luxury vehicles purchased with Vanguard corporate funds were now the legal property of my holding company and would remain exactly where they were. I told them that if they were not out of my house when the 5 minutes expired, I would signal my private security team waiting at the end of the driveway to come inside and physically escort them off the premises. Richard just stared at me, his jaw slack and his eyes wide. His entire worldview, his absolute belief in his own untouchable superiority, had been completely shattered in a matter of seconds. Jamal was already backing away from the table, his legal mind racing frantically. I could practically see the gears turning in his head as he desperately tried to figure out how to save himself from the massive federal fallout that was about to rain down on his career. But Brittany did not freeze. Brittany had never been told no in her entire life. She had never faced a single consequence for her actions, and her brain simply could not process the reality of being stripped of her wealth and status. The carefully constructed facade of the elegant, pregnant lifestyle guru evaporated instantly. Brittany let out a sound that was not entirely human. It was a high-pitched, feral scream of pure, unadulterated rage. She slammed her hands down onto the edge of the mahogany table and vaulted herself forward. She did not care about the elegant place settings, the expensive crystal, or the holiday feast. She lunged directly across the center of the table, kicking her designer heels violently against the polished wood. Her sudden, explosive movement caught everyone completely off guard. Her knees crashed violently into the heavy silver platter holding the massive Thanksgiving turkey, sending the entire bird sliding rapidly across the white linen tablecloth. It slammed heavily into the crystal gravy boat, launching a wave of thick brown liquid into the air before crashing onto the imported marble floor. Wine glasses shattered into 100 jagged pieces, sending dark red stains bleeding across the pristine white fabric like open wounds. Brittany scrambled over the ruined feast, her manicured hands reaching out like claws aiming directly for my face. She screamed that I was a worthless, jealous monster, and that I was not going to take her perfect life away. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not engage in a physical brawl with a pregnant woman. I simply took one swift, calculated step backward out of her reach. Without her target to grab onto, Brittany lost her balance completely. She slipped on the spilled red wine and crashed hard onto the edge of the table, knocking a heavy silver candlestick to the floor with a deafening clatter. Jamal finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock and rushed forward. He wrapped his arms tightly around her waist, dragging her backward off the table. He yelled her name, demanding that she stop before she made things exponentially worse, but Brittany was completely inconsolable. She thrashed wildly against his grip, kicking her legs and screaming obscenities at the top of her lungs, her designer dress stained with grease and wine. The dining room was an absolute disaster zone. Shattered glass, ruined food, and spilled wine covered the beautiful floors. The perfect Thanksgiving dinner was completely destroyed, mirroring the exact state of their fake lives. In the midst of the violent chaos, Susan saw an opportunity. She did not rush over to check on her pregnant daughter. She did not help Jamal pull Brittany away from the table. Instead, Susan backed away from the wreckage, her eyes darting frantically around the room until they landed on the antique landline telephone sitting on the hallway credenza. Susan knew that I held all the financial and legal cards. She knew she could not fight the finalized deed to the house sitting on the table. But Susan was a master manipulator who knew exactly how to twist a narrative to weaponize the authorities against anyone who defied her. She lunged for the phone, snatching the receiver off the cradle and aggressively punching in the 3 digits for emergency services. She turned her back to me, but I could see her shoulders rise and fall as she instantly transformed her demeanor. Susan let out a loud theatrical sob, forcing genuine tears to stream down her face. When the emergency dispatcher answered the line, Susan put on an absolutely flawless Oscar-worthy performance. She did not speak with the cold, arrogant tone she had used just 10 minutes ago when she was insulting my clothes and my career. She spoke with the trembling, terrified voice of a helpless older woman fearing for her life. "Please, you have to help us," Susan wailed into the receiver, her voice cracking with manufactured terror. "You have to send the police immediately. We have a violent intruder in our home." She gave the dispatcher the exact address of the estate, her voice shaking violently to sell the illusion of panic. "No, she does not have a gun, but she is completely deranged. It is my estranged daughter. She broke into our house while we were having our quiet Thanksgiving dinner. She is having a massive psychotic break, and she is physically attacking my pregnant daughter. Please, you have to hurry. She is destroying the house, and she is going to kill my baby." She continued to sob hysterically into the phone, feeding the emergency dispatcher lie after vicious lie. She claimed I had completely lost my mind, that I was violently throwing things around the room, and that they were trapped in the dining room, unable to escape my wrath. Jamal froze, still holding a thrashing Brittany by the shoulders. He looked over at Susan, and the sheer panic on his face deepened into pure terror. Jamal was a seasoned corporate lawyer. He knew that filing a false police report was a serious crime, but more importantly, he knew that involving the local police meant bringing armed law enforcement directly into a house where massive corporate fraud had just been openly discussed. He shook his head wildly at Susan, silently begging her to hang up the phone before she ruined everything. But Susan completely ignored him. She was entirely focused on her performance, playing the ultimate victim to the very end, convinced that her tears would save her. I stood amidst the wreckage of their lavish holiday dinner, my expensive midnight blue suit completely untouched by the flying food and broken glass. I watched my mother weep fake tears into the telephone, actively trying to frame me for a violent felony, just to regain control of the situation. 10 years ago, seeing my own mother lie to the police to have me arrested would have absolutely broken my spirit. It would have sent me into a spiral of desperate apologies, trying to convince her that I was a good person who did not deserve to go to jail. Now it just confirmed exactly what I already knew. They were toxic to their very core, and they would destroy anyone to protect their comfortable lies. I did not interrupt her phone call. I did not yell out that she was lying to the dispatcher. I just stood perfectly still, letting the hidden microphone clipped inside my jacket capture every single word of her fraudulent report. Susan thought she was calling the police to save her lifestyle and punish me for fighting back. She had absolutely no idea that she was just handing me the final nail to permanently seal all of their coffins. The distant wail of police sirens cut through the suffocating silence of the dining room almost immediately. In a wealthy Connecticut suburb like Fairfield County, the emergency response time for a violent home invasion was less than 3 minutes. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the manicured snow outside, casting erratic, sweeping shadows through the massive bay windows of the estate. Heavy boots pounded against the imported marble of the grand foyer. 2 local police officers burst through the unlocked front doors with their hands resting defensively on their utility belts. They rushed into the dining room and immediately froze, taking in the absolute destruction. To an untrained eye, the scene matched my mother's frantic phone call perfectly. The shattered crystal, the overturned heavy silver platters, and the dark red wine pooling on the pristine white tablecloth looked exactly like the aftermath of a violent struggle. Brittany was violently sobbing, burying her face into Jamal's expensive suit jacket while Susan cowered near the hallway credenza, clutching her chest as if she were about to collapse from sheer terror. Jamal saw the officers and instantly recognized his single window of opportunity to regain total control. He completely dropped the terrified expression he had worn just moments ago and seamlessly slipped back into his role as the untouchable, high-profile corporate attorney. He stepped forward, shielding Brittany with his body, and offered the leading officer a familiar, reassuring nod. Sergeant Miller Jamal said, his voice projecting the perfect blend of authority and manufactured relief. "Thank God you guys got here so quickly. We have a highly volatile situation on our hands." Sergeant Miller relaxed his defensive posture the moment he recognized Jamal. Jamal was a pillar of the local community. He funded the police athletic leagues, attended the town charity galas, and played golf with the local judges. "Jamal, what the hell happened here?" Miller asked, his eyes scanning the ruined feast. "Are Susan and Richard all right?" Jamal placed a gentle hand on the officer's shoulder, stepping effortlessly into the officer's personal space to establish camaraderie and control the narrative. "We are shaken up, but we are physically okay," Jamal lied smoothly, his tone dripping with fake empathy. "It is my sister-in-law, Clare. She has a long documented history of severe mental instability. We have not seen her in 10 years, but she broke into the house tonight right in the middle of our family Thanksgiving dinner." Jamal shook his head, looking at me with profound manufactured pity. "She started screaming about massive corporate conspiracies demanding money, and then she completely snapped. She destroyed the table and tried to physically attack my pregnant wife. We tried to calm her down, but she is completely out of her mind." Susan let out a perfectly timed whimper, leaning against the wall for support. Richard stood stiffly at the head of the table, playing the part of the exhausted, heartbroken patriarch. They were all flawlessly feeding into Jamal's narrative. The two officers turned their attention entirely to me. I was standing calmly amidst the wreckage, my expensive midnight blue designer suit completely spotless, not a single hair out of place. I did not look like a deranged attacker. But in the eyes of the local police, I was the outsider. I was the estranged daughter who had supposedly lost her mind while Jamal and Richard were the respected, wealthy victims. Sergeant Miller stepped over a broken wine glass, his hand resting firmly on his radio. "Mom, I need you to step away from the table and keep your hands exactly where I can see them," he ordered, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. I did not raise my hands in panic. I simply gestured gracefully toward the center of the mahogany table. "Officer," I said, my voice perfectly calm and measured, "if you look right there on the table, you will find a finalized warranty deed stamped by the county clerk this morning. I am the sole legal owner of this estate. The people you are talking to are currently trespassing on my private property and attacking me." Jamal let out a heavy theatrical sigh, cutting off the officer before he could even look at the paper. "She printed fake legal documents off the internet, Miller," Jamal said, using a soothing, patronizing tone. "It is part of her paranoid delusion. She thinks she bought our family company. She thinks she bought this house. We tried to talk her down and get her psychiatric help, but she just became incredibly violent. She needs to be removed from the premises immediately before she hurts my baby." The officer did not even glance at the authentic legal document resting on the table. He looked at Jamal and made his decision instantly. The wealthy, established lawyer was a reliable source. The calm woman standing in the middle of a destroyed dining room claiming to own a $4 million mansion was clearly having a psychotic break. Sergeant Miller signaled to his younger partner. They approached me quickly, flanking me on both sides. "Claire, you need to turn around and place your hands behind your back," Miller instructed, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for breaking and entering and domestic assault." Brittany peeked out from behind Jamal's shoulder, a cruel, victorious smirk briefly flashing across her tear-stained face. She thought she had won. Richard stood tall, finally looking satisfied that his disobedient daughter was being put in her place. Jamal let out a slow, quiet breath of relief, believing he had just successfully neutralized the biggest threat to his criminal empire. I did not fight back. I did not yell about my rights or scream that they were making a massive mistake. I knew exactly how the justice system worked when wealthy, connected people manipulated it. Fighting the police in the middle of a dining room would only validate their false narrative. It would give Jamal exactly what he wanted, which was an undeniable reason to lock me away. I slowly turned around and placed my hands firmly behind my back. The cold, heavy metal of the handcuffs snapped tightly around my wrists with a sharp clicking sound. The officers patted me down, quickly checking my coat pockets for weapons, but they completely missed the tiny, high-definition microphone securely clipped inside the lapel of my blazer. The younger officer grabbed my arm forcefully, guiding me through the wreckage of the dining room. I walked with my head held high, my posture absolutely perfect. I walked past my mother, who refused to look me in the eye. I walked past my father, who was already pouring himself another glass of wine to celebrate his false victory. And I walked right past Jamal, who leaned in close as the officers led me by. "I told you that you were out of your depth, Claire." Jamal whispered, his voice so low only I and my hidden microphone could hear it. "I own this town. You are going to rot in a holding cell while I fix this entire mess." I did not respond to his arrogant whisper. I just offered him a brief, freezing smile before the officers marched me out of the grand foyer and into the freezing Connecticut night. The icy wind hit my face as they guided me down the stone steps toward the waiting police cruiser. The flashing lights illuminated the faces of the nosy, wealthy neighbors who had stepped out onto their massive porches to watch the spectacle. The officers pushed me down into the hard plastic back seat of the squad car and slammed the heavy door shut, sealing me inside the cramped space. The engine roared to life, and the cruiser pulled out of my massive circular driveway, heading straight for the local precinct. My family thought they had just brilliantly disposed of a massive problem. They thought they had outsmarted me, using the local authorities to silence the truth. But as I sat in the back of the police car watching my beautiful estate fade into the distance, I felt absolutely no fear. Every lie Jamal told the officers, every false tear my mother cried, and every arrogant threat they whispered had been perfectly recorded and instantly transmitted to my private security team. The trap was fully set, and my family had just eagerly locked themselves inside it. The ride to the local police precinct was a blur of passing streetlights and the harsh crackle of the police radio. I sat in the cramped back seat of the cruiser, feeling the cold steel of the handcuffs digging slightly into my wrists. I did not say a word to the two officers in the front. When we arrived at the station, I was escorted through the brightly lit, bustling bullpen of the precinct. Telephones were ringing, uniform officers were typing up reports, and the smell of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner hung thick in the air. I was quickly processed, fingerprinted, and led down a narrow cinderblock hallway away from the main hub of activity. The younger officer opened a heavy metal door and directed me inside. He removed my handcuffs, massaged my wrists briefly out of habit, and told me a public defender would be with me shortly. Then he walked out, pulling the heavy door shut. The loud metallic clank of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the small space. I was completely alone in a standard police interrogation room. It was exactly like the ones you see in television dramas. There was a cold stainless steel table bolted directly to the gray linoleum floor, two uncomfortable metal chairs, and a large mirrored window taking up the majority of the right wall. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, incessant buzzing sound. I pulled out one of the metal chairs and sat down, crossing my legs and folding my hands neatly on my lap. I took a deep breath, letting the absolute quiet of the room settle over me. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. I knew Jamal could not resist the opportunity to gloat. He was a man driven entirely by his own massive ego and his desperate need to maintain control over every situation. He would never let a random public defender handle this. He would want to deliver the final killing blow himself. I did not have to wait long. Less than 20 minutes later, the heavy deadbolt clicked and the metal door swung open. It was not a detective. It was not a court-appointed attorney. It was Jamal. He stepped into the harsh fluorescent light of the interrogation room, looking entirely out of place in his expensive custom-tailored suit. He carried his heavy leather briefcase in one hand and pushed the metal door shut with the other. He did not look panicked or angry anymore. He looked incredibly relaxed. He looked like a man who had just successfully secured his own absolute victory. Jamal walked over to the stainless steel table and set his briefcase down with a heavy thud. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, pulled out the metal chair across from me, and sat down, making himself completely comfortable. He rested his forearms on the table and looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. "Where is my attorney?" I asked, my voice perfectly flat, giving him absolutely nothing to work with. Jamal let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. "I sent him home, Claire," he said smoothly, waving his hand in the air. "The duty defender tonight is a kid fresh out of law school who I actually play golf with on weekends. I told him this was a highly sensitive domestic dispute, and that as the family attorney, I would be stepping in to advise you privately." He was more than happy to hand over the paperwork and take an early coffee break. "You and I have the room entirely to ourselves for as long as we need." He reached out and tapped his polished fingernails against the cold steel table. He was establishing his dominance, showing me that his influence extended far beyond corporate boardrooms. He wanted me to know that he controlled the local police, the local lawyers, and my immediate future. Jamal popped the brass latches on his briefcase and reached inside. "I really have to hand it to you, Claire," he began, his tone dropping into a patronizing register. "You played a very aggressive game tonight. Buying the debt, seizing the trust account, foreclosing on the house. It was brilliant. It really was. For a few minutes back there in the dining room, you actually had me sweating." He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on crisp white paper and laid them out neatly on the steel table between us. "But your fatal flaw has always been your emotions," Jamal continued, shaking his head with mock disappointment. "You let your bitter jealousy toward Brittany cloud your judgment. You thought you could walk into my town, into my family's home, and bully us into submission. But you forgot that I write the rules around here." He spun the documents around so they were facing me. It was a new set of transfer deeds. They were legally binding contracts explicitly relinquishing all of my shares in Vanguard Holdings and transferring the absolute ownership of the Connecticut estate back into Richard's name. Sitting right on top of the signature line was his expensive gold fountain pen. "Let us talk about reality," Jamal said, leaning forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "Right now, the desk sergeant outside is typing up a formal arrest report. You are being charged with felony breaking and entering, felony destruction of property, and felony aggravated assault against a pregnant woman. That is a guaranteed mandatory minimum sentence in a state penitentiary." I looked down at the paperwork and then back up at him, keeping my facial expression entirely blank. I let the silence hang, urging him to keep talking. Jamal took my silence as a sign of submission. He leaned in closer, dropping his voice into a harsh, threatening whisper. "Do you know what happens to a senior forensic accountant when they are indicted for a violent felony, Claire? The state regulatory board will immediately suspend your certified public accountant license. Your partners back in London will forcefully buy out your equity at pennies on the dollar to protect the firm from the public relations nightmare. Your entire career, the one you spent 10 miserable years building from scratch, will evaporate overnight. You will be completely ruined." He sat back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He was offering me a devil's bargain. "But because I am a generous man, and because it is a holiday, I am going to offer you a way out," Jamal said, smiling a predatory smile. "You sign these papers right now. You give us back our company, and you give Richard back his house. If you do that, I will walk out to that front desk, and I will tell Sergeant Miller that my wife has decided not to press charges." I will tell them it was just a terrible misunderstanding brought on by your fragile mental state. You get to walk out the front door, catch the next flight back to London, and keep your precious career. It was textbook extortion happening right inside a police precinct. He was using the threat of the criminal justice system to steal a multi-million-dollar corporation and a massive estate, and he was entirely confident that he was going to get away with it. I looked at him and let out a soft, quiet sigh. And what makes you think the police will not look into my side of the story, Jamal? I asked, keeping my voice intentionally small and vulnerable. What makes you think a judge will not look at the deed to the house and realize you are lying? Jamal burst out laughing. The sound was harsh and incredibly cruel, echoing off the bare cinder block walls. He leaned across the metal table, invading my personal space, his face inches from mine. Because nobody is going to believe you, Claire, he whispered fiercely, his eyes cold and dead. Look at yourself. You are a crazy, bitter outcast who has not spoken to her family in a decade. You are estranged. You are alone. Meanwhile, I am a respected pillar of this community. Richard is a wealthy philanthropist. Brittany is a beautiful pregnant mother. He reached out and tapped his finger aggressively against the table, right next to the gold pen. When it comes down to your word against ours, who do you really think the judge is going to believe? Jamal sneered. They are going to see a jealous, unstable woman who suffered a massive psychotic break and attacked her own family out of pure spite. They are going to lock you in a padded room or a concrete cell and throw away the key. We control the narrative, Claire. We always have. You are nothing in this town without us. He was utilizing the ultimate form of psychological warfare. He was actively trying to gaslight me into believing my reality was entirely fabricated. He was trying to break my spirit using the exact same toxic rhetoric my parents had used when they stole my college fund and banished me to Europe. He wanted me to feel completely helpless, entirely isolated, and completely dependent on his mercy to survive. 10 years ago, sitting in this exact chair, I would have believed every single word he said. I would have picked up that gold pen with trembling hands and signed away my entire life just to escape the crushing weight of his psychological abuse. I would have sacrificed my own future just to buy my freedom from their manipulation. But I did not reach for the pen. I did not cry. I did not even blink. I sat perfectly still, feeling the solid, comforting weight of the high-definition microphone hidden securely inside the lapel of my blazer. It was actively recording every single threat, every single extortion demand, and every single confession of his malicious intent. I looked at the clock mounted on the cinder block wall above the mirrored glass. The red second hand ticked methodically, sweeping past the 12. I looked back down at Jamal, studying the absolute arrogance radiating from his pores. He thought he was the smartest man in the world. He thought he had just delivered the perfect legal checkmate. He had absolutely no idea that he was currently digging his own grave with a backhoe and broadcasting it live to a team of highly trained federal investigators. I looked at the red second hand of the clock on the cinder block wall as it swept past the 12. It was exactly 7 o'clock in the evening. I turned my attention back to Jamal, who was still sitting across from me, with that arrogant, predatory smile waiting for me to break. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold steel table, and finally broke my silence. "It is 7 o'clock. Jamal," I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any fear. "Exactly 1 week to the minute since my flight landed at John F. Kennedy Airport. Exactly 1 week since you and my sister told me to take an Uber because my presence was not your problem." Jamal rolled his eyes, letting out a loud, exaggerated sigh. He shifted in his metal chair, clearly annoyed that I was stalling. He thought I was just being sentimental and pathetic, clinging to family grievances, while he was offering me a serious legal ultimatum. He tapped his finger aggressively against the table, pointing at the gold fountain pen. "Save the emotional speeches for your therapist," Clare. Jamal sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "I do not care about the airport. I care about the signature. Pick up the pen and sign the papers before I run out of patience and leave you here to rot." I did not touch the pen. I just offered him a small, chilling smile. I told him he should really check his phone. Jamal frowned, his arrogant facade slipping just a fraction. He did not understand the pivot. His hand instinctively went to the inside pocket of his custom-tailored suit jacket. I did not wait for him to pull the device out. I kept my eyes locked onto his and began to dismantle his entire reality piece by piece. I told him that my London equity firm does not just employ forensic accountants. We handle multi-billion-dollar hostile takeovers, which means we also employ a highly specialized elite corporate security team. A team that I had stationed at the end of the long driveway of my Connecticut estate the entire evening. I reached up with my handcuffed hands and tapped my fingers lightly against the lapel of my midnight blue blazer, right where the high-definition microphone was securely concealed beneath the expensive fabric. I watched the color rapidly drain from Jamal's face as I explained that I had been wearing a wire since the moment I stepped out of my Maybach. I told him that my security team did not just record the Thanksgiving dinner for my own personal records. They had been live streaming the audio directly to a highly encrypted cloud server, and simultaneously, they had been forwarding that exact same live audio feed directly to the regional director of the FBI White-Collar Crime Division in New York City. Jamal's hands began to tremble violently. The thick, confident posture he had maintained for the last hour completely collapsed. I laid out exactly what the federal agents had just listened to. I told him they heard Richard openly admitting to embezzling over $20 million in investor capital to fund Britney's vanity brand. They heard Richard confessing to attempting to hide liquid assets in an offshore blind trust to evade massive corporate debt. They heard Susan faking a violent domestic assault call to the local police dispatcher, committing felony perjury to manipulate law enforcement. And most importantly, I whispered, leaning closer to him across the steel table. They just heard the highly respected corporate attorney Jamal actively committing felony extortion inside a local police precinct. They heard you threaten to destroy my career and manipulate the district attorney to drop state felony charges in exchange for a multi-million-dollar property deed. Jamal stared at me in absolute horrified silence. The gold fountain pen slipped from his trembling fingers and rolled across the stainless steel table, dropping onto the gray linoleum floor with a sharp clatter. He scrambled to pull his smartphone out of his jacket pocket. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the device. The bright screen lit up the dim space between us. He had dozens of emergency notifications, missed calls from his law firm partners, urgent texts from his legal assistants. Panic was written all over the glowing screen. I told him he did not need to read the text to know what was happening. I explained that the FBI had already raided his corner office downtown. They were currently seizing his computer servers, freezing his legal escrow accounts, and carrying boxes of his fabricated financial records out into the street. The reality of his complete destruction hit him like a physical blow. The smooth, calculated fixer was entirely gone. In his place sat a desperate, cornered animal whose entire fraudulent empire had just been vaporized in a matter of seconds. He shoved his metal chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the floor. He lunged for the heavy metal door, desperate to escape the interrogation room, desperate to run before the walls completely closed in on him. He grabbed the heavy brass handle, pulling on it with all his strength. But before he could even turn the deadbolt, the heavy metal door swung open violently from the outside. Jamal stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding being hit in the face. Sergeant Miller, the local officer who had arrested me just an hour ago, stood in the doorway. He looked incredibly pale, sweating profusely and entirely terrified. But he was not the one running the show anymore. Behind him stood two massive men wearing dark suits and heavy tactical vests with the letters FBI printed in bold yellow across their chests. The lead federal agent stepped into the small interrogation room, completely ignoring my presence. He locked his eyes directly onto Jamal. He did not ask questions. He did not offer a polite professional greeting or ask Jamal to come quietly. The agent lunged forward, firmly grabbing Jamal by the shoulder. He spun the wealthy corporate attorney around with brutal efficiency and slammed him face first against the mirrored glass wall. Jamal let out a pathetic gasp of pain as his cheeks smashed against the cold glass. The agent kicked Jamal's legs apart, forcing him into a wide, vulnerable stance, and forcefully pulled his arms tightly behind his back. Jamal started sobbing. It was a loud, ugly sound of pure, unadulterated terror. "Please," he begged, his voice cracking. "Please, there is a massive misunderstanding. I am a lawyer. I am an officer of the court. You cannot do this to me. You have to listen to me." The federal agent ignored his pathetic pleas. He pulled out a pair of heavy tactical handcuffs and snapped them brutally onto Jamal's wrists, clicking them shut with a loud, terrifying finality. He pressed his forearm against the back of Jamal's neck, holding him firmly against the glass. The agent leaned in close to Jamal's ear and began reading him his Miranda rights in a rapid, completely monotonous voice. He listed the federal charges one by one, letting each word hang in the cold air of the room. Wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, felony forgery, felony extortion, witness tampering, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaming down his face, ruining his pristine image. He knew there was no talking his way out of federal charges. He knew his career was over, his wealth was gone, and he was going to spend the best years of his life in a federal penitentiary. Sergeant Miller walked over to the stainless steel table, unable to look me in the eye. His hands were shaking slightly as he pulled out his standard issue key. He reached behind me and quickly unlocked my handcuffs, freeing my wrists. The heavy metal cuffs dropped to the table with a clink. Miller mumbled a quiet, frantic apology. He stumbled over his words, stating that the local precinct had absolutely no idea what was actually going on, and that all state charges against me were being immediately and permanently dropped. He treated me with the utmost respect, terrified that his own job was now on the line for participating in my false arrest. I stood up slowly, rubbing my wrists to restore the circulation. I smoothed the minor wrinkles out of my midnight blue blazer, adjusting my cuffs with complete composure. I looked down at the thick stack of transfer deeds Jamal had tried to force me to sign. I picked up the crisp white papers and tore them cleanly in half, dropping the useless pieces onto the cold steel table. I walked over to where Jamal was pinned against the glass, still sobbing uncontrollably, as the second federal agent began violently patting down his pockets for evidence. Jamal turned his head slightly, looking at me with eyes full of utter defeat and pure hatred. I leaned in incredibly close to him, ensuring he could hear my final words over his own pathetic crying. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and offered him a slow, satisfied smile. I reminded him of the exact words he had used against me back at the Plaza Hotel. "You were absolutely right about one thing, Jamal," I whispered, my voice cold as ice. "You are playing in the major leagues now, and you are way out of your depth." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on him, walked out of the interrogation room, and headed straight down the cinder-block hallway toward the precinct exit, fully prepared to watch the rest of my toxic family fall completely to pieces. I walked out the heavy glass doors of the police precinct and took a deep breath of the freezing night air. The flashing lights of the squad cars reflected in the shallow puddles on the pavement, but the chaos behind me was no longer my concern. My chauffeur was waiting by the Maybach, exactly where I had instructed him to be. He opened the rear door, and I sank into the quiet luxury of the leather seat. I directed him to take me back to the Plaza Hotel. I watched the dark streets of the Connecticut suburbs roll by, feeling an absolute profound peace that I had not experienced since I was a little girl. The heavy weight of seeking my family's approval was completely gone. I slept that night in my penthouse suite without waking up a single time. When the sun rose the next morning, the entire world had shifted, and the sequence of dominoes I had carefully lined up began to fall with devastating speed. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the financial news networks were completely consumed by the story. But it was not the fabricated smear campaign my father had threatened to release. It was a massive, explosive federal exposé. Federal agents had spent the entire night tearing apart the corporate headquarters of Vanguard Holdings. They carried out dozens of cardboard boxes filled with hard drives, financial ledgers, and completely forged loan documents. Richard was indicted on 72 federal counts, including wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud. I sat at the marble kitchen island in my hotel suite, drinking a cup of hot black coffee while watching the morning news broadcast. The television showed footage of my father being escorted out of a cheap roadside motel by two armed federal agents. He was wearing the same wrinkled shirt from Thanksgiving dinner, and his wrists were locked tightly in steel handcuffs. The untouchable, wealthy patriarch, who had ruled our family with absolute cruelty, looked completely small, fragile, and entirely defeated. He kept his head down, refusing to look at the cameras as they shoved him into the back of a dark government vehicle. Jamal faced an even swifter and far more brutal destruction. The federal prosecutors did not waste a single second with the corrupt corporate lawyer. He was arraigned in federal court before noon. Because I had handed the FBI the pristine audio recording of his confession, detailing exactly how he utilized offshore accounts to hide stolen money, the federal judge officially deemed him an extreme flight risk. The judge aggressively denied his request for bail. The brilliant, charismatic fixer, who had arrogantly threatened to throw me in prison just 12 hours ago, was stripped of his custom-tailored suit and remanded immediately to a high-security federal holding facility. The State Bar Association filed an emergency motion before lunch, and his legal license was permanently suspended pending the criminal trial. His entire career was vaporized in a single morning. The collapse of their financial house of cards triggered an immediate and brutal reality check for my mother and sister. Without the stolen Vanguard funds secretly flowing into her business accounts, Brittany's luxury lifestyle brand died instantly. Her massive corporate checks bounced across the city. By Wednesday afternoon, the commercial landlord of her premium Manhattan storefront changed the heavy brass locks and seized her entire inventory for months of unpaid rent. Her employees walked out the second their direct deposits failed to clear. Brittany tried to pivot her narrative. She attempted to use her personal platinum credit cards to book a luxury hotel suite to escape the media fallout, but every single swipe was loudly and publicly declined. The offshore accounts were frozen, the trust fund was empty, and the corporate credit lines were completely terminated. The golden child who had spent her entire life buying her way out of consequences was suddenly standing on the street with absolutely nothing to her name. The social fallout in their pristine Connecticut suburb was absolute. In Fairfield County, wealth and status are the only currencies that matter, and the community operates with a ruthless hive mentality. When the news of the embezzlement hit, the elite social circles completely slammed their doors shut. Susan attempted to attend her regular Thursday afternoon charity luncheon at the exclusive country club. She put on her expensive pearls and tried to strut through the front doors, pretending that her husband was simply the victim of a massive corporate misunderstanding. She did not even make it past the lobby. The general manager of the club intercepted her in front of dozens of wealthy onlookers. He quietly but firmly informed her that her family membership had been permanently revoked, citing the strict morality clause in their contract. He asked her to leave the premises immediately and threatened to call the police if she caused a scene. Susan was publicly turned away, forced to walk back to her cheap rental car, while her former friends completely ignored her gaze. My family was instantly transformed from local royalty to total pariahs. Their wealthy friends stopped taking their calls. Their neighbors refused to look at them in the grocery store. The toxic, heavily insulated bubble they had lived inside for decades violently popped, leaving them completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving elements of the real world. They became the ultimate cautionary tale of the neighborhood. While their lives completely disintegrated, my slate was wiped entirely clean. Sergeant Miller and the local precinct moved faster than I had ever seen law enforcement move. The completely fabricated domestic assault and trespassing charges against me were formally dismissed and scrubbed from my record before the weekend even started. The police department wanted absolutely no part in a federal extortion scandal. My forensic accounting license remained perfectly intact. In fact, my professional reputation skyrocketed. My senior partners back in London called me specifically to congratulate me. The hostile takeover of Vanguard Holdings and the immediate aggressive recovery of the stolen offshore assets was hailed across the financial sector as one of the most brilliant, ruthless equity plays of the decade. I was not the unstable, bitter outcast my family tried to paint me as. I was a highly respected, legendary corporate strategist. Exactly 1 week after the disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, I drove back out to the Connecticut estate. The bank had finalized all the rapid foreclosure paperwork. The massive $4 million property was entirely mine, and the local authorities had ensured it was completely vacated. I stood in the center of the massive circular driveway, wearing a thick wool coat against the biting winter chill. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue. I watched as a massive fleet of heavy construction trucks rolled through the wrought iron gates. I had hired a premium commercial demolition crew. I did not want to live in the home where I had been so thoroughly abused my entire life, and I certainly did not want to keep their toxic, suffocating memories intact. I walked up the wide stone steps, unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors, and gave the construction foreman the official order to begin. I stood in the grand foyer and watched as a worker swung a massive steel sledgehammer directly into the expensive wood-paneled walls of the formal dining room. The loud cracking sound of the wood splintering and the drywall collapsing was the most beautiful music I had ever heard in my entire life. They tore out the glittering crystal chandeliers. They smashed the imported marble floors with jackhammers, turning the pristine stone into unrecognizable rubble. They ripped out the suffocating pale blue walls of my old childhood bedroom, tossing the debris out the second-story windows into a massive metal dumpster waiting below. I watched the physical destruction of my traumatic past happen right in front of my eyes. The fortress of expectations I could never quite meet was being violently leveled to the ground. I was stripping the house down to its bare wooden studs, actively erasing every single trace of Richard, Susan, and Brittany. My real estate development team had already drawn up the blueprints for a massive modern architectural renovation. We were going completely tear away the old colonial facade and rebuild a sleek modern masterpiece in its place. Once the construction was completed, I was going to flip the entire estate on the luxury market for a massive multi-million-dollar profit. I stood in the driveway, breathing in the sharp smell of sawdust and crushed plaster. The cold wind whipped through my hair, but I felt incredibly warm. I had taken the exact weapon they used to destroy me, and I had used it to build an empire. The slate was completely clean. The toxic roots had been entirely ripped from the soil. The empire they built on lies and stolen money had completely collapsed into dust, and I was the one holding the deed to the land. Exactly 1 month passed since the demolition crew tore down the last standing wall of the Connecticut estate. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in Manhattan. I was sitting at a corner table in an exclusive high-end cafe on the Upper East Side. The air smelled of freshly roasted espresso beans and expensive pastries. My laptop was open in front of me, displaying the final liquidation charts for Vanguard Holdings. The corporate dismantling was almost entirely complete. My firm was highly profitable, and my personal life was incredibly quiet. It was the kind of profound, absolute peace you only achieve after permanently cutting out a malignant tumor. The heavy glass door of the cafe chimed softly, announcing new customers. I did not look up immediately, but then I heard a familiar voice arguing quietly with the hostess. I raised my eyes from my screen and felt a momentary wave of genuine disbelief. Standing in the entrance of the luxury cafe were my mother Susan and my sister Brittany. The transformation was absolutely staggering. A month ago, they were draped in $70,000 designer outfits, dripping with diamonds, and demanding absolute submission from everyone around them. Today, they looked completely unrecognizable. Susan was wearing a dull gray wool coat that looked like it had been bought at a clearance rack. Her perfectly styled hair was flat and stringy. The heavy, expensive makeup she used to mask her age was completely gone, revealing deep, dark circles under her tired, sunken eyes. Brittany stood slightly behind her, heavily pregnant and looking entirely defeated. She was wearing cheap black leggings and a faded, oversized sweater that swallowed her frame. There was no Birkin bag, there were no arrogant smirks. The flawless golden child aesthetic had been entirely washed away. They looked like two exhausted women who had spent the last 30 days living out of a suitcase in a damp, cheap highway motel room, which was exactly what they were doing. Susan frantically scanned the room and her eyes locked onto mine. For a fraction of a second, she froze. She knew she had absolutely no right to approach me. She knew the bridges were not just burned, they had been entirely vaporized by federal indictments. But desperation completely overrides pride. She practically shoved past the hostess and rushed across the cafe toward my table. Brittany trailed behind her, dragging her feet, keeping her eyes fixed firmly on the polished hardwood floor, completely unable to look me in the face. "Claire," Susan gasped, her voice trembling heavily as she stopped right in front of my table. "Please, please do not walk away. Just give me 2 minutes." I sat perfectly still. I did not close my laptop. I did not invite them to sit down. I just picked up my porcelain espresso cup and took a slow, deliberate sip. Susan reached out, grabbing the edge of my table with shaking hands. Genuine tears began to spill over her eyelashes and stream down her pale cheeks. These were not the fake theatrical tears she cried for the police dispatcher on Thanksgiving. This was the raw, ugly crying of a woman who had completely hit rock bottom and realized her entire false reality was gone forever. "Claire, you have to help us," Susan begged, her voice cracking loudly enough to draw stares from the other wealthy patrons sitting nearby. "Your father is locked in a federal holding cell. We have absolutely nothing left. The government froze all of our personal bank accounts. We are living in a disgusting motel out on the interstate. We cannot even afford to buy decent groceries. Brittany is going to have her baby in less than 2 months and she has nowhere to go." She took a ragged, panicked breath, leaning closer across the table. "I am begging you," Susan pleaded, the tears dripping off her chin. "I know we made mistakes. I know things got completely out of hand, but we are still your family. You are my daughter, please. You have hundreds of millions of dollars now. You have the company. Just pay for a good defense lawyer to get Jamal out on bail. Just buy Brittany a small townhouse. It does not have to be anything fancy. Just a safe, warm place for the baby. You have the power to fix this, Claire. Please do the right thing." I listened to her frantic, desperate speech. I looked at Brittany, who finally raised her head. Her eyes were red, puffy, and swollen from weeks of crying. She looked at me with a pathetic, silent plea, hoping that my basic human decency would kick in and save her from the catastrophic consequences of her own horrific actions. They really thought that because I was fundamentally a good person, I would eventually cave. They thought the biological tie between us would act as an emergency parachute after they pushed me out of the airplane. They wanted me to save the man who tried to forge my signature and put me in prison. They wanted me to buy a house for the sister who laughed while I was arrested. They wanted me to fund the lives of the people who stole my college education and banished me to another continent. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, heavy moment. The cafe had gone completely quiet around us. I took one final sip of my espresso, savoring the rich, bitter taste. I placed the delicate porcelain cup gently onto its matching saucer. Then I reached into my designer handbag. I did not pull out my platinum credit card. I did not pull out a checkbook to fund a legal defense. I pulled out a single crisp $5 bill. I placed the bill onto the table to cover the cost of my coffee. I calmly closed my laptop and slipped it into my leather bag. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored coat. I looked my mother directly in her tear-filled eyes. Then I looked at my sister. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt absolutely nothing for them. The emotional hold they once had over me was entirely dead. I looked them dead in the eye and kept my voice perfectly level. "Not my problem," I said. "You should have planned better." Susan let out a sharp, devastated gasp, stepping backward, as if I had just physically struck her across the face. Brittany buried her face in her hands and began to sob quietly, her shoulders shaking with the absolute realization that no one was coming to save her. I did not stay to watch them cry. I walked right past them, my heels clicking confidently against the polished floor. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the bright, crisp Manhattan morning, leaving them standing alone in their own ruins. The Maybach was idling at the curb. My driver stepped out immediately and opened the rear door for me. As I slid into the luxurious, quiet interior, I felt a profound sense of absolute liberation wash over my entire soul. The heavy, suffocating chains of my toxic family were permanently severed. I had reclaimed my life, my career, and my absolute self-worth. I looked out the tinted window as the car pulled away into the city traffic, fully ready to begin the rest of my life. Have you ever had to walk away from the people who were supposed to love you the most? Have you ever realized that setting hard boundaries and cutting toxic ties is the only way to truly save yourself? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you believe that karma always comes to collect the debts we owe, hit that subscribe button. Thank you for watching. And remember, your worth is never determined by the people who failed to appreciate you.